The Georgia heat pressed down on us like a suffocating blanket as we gathered around Grandmother Abigail's mahogany casket. Spanish moss hung heavy from the ancient oaks that had witnessed 3 generations of Whitmore burials, their branches casting long shadows across the family cemetery. The year was 1872, and even in death, Grandmother commanded the same reverence she had in life. I stood between my father, Colonel James Whitmore, and my mother, Eleanor, both dressed in the finest mourning attire money could buy. The black silk of my dress clung uncomfortably to my skin in the humid air, but propriety demanded we endure. Around us, the extended Whitmore family formed a perfect circle of grief, or what passed for grief, among people who measured emotions like they measured cotton yields. Pastor Jeremiah Hawthorne had served our family for over 20 years. His weathered hands trembled as he held the worn Bible, and I noticed how his eyes kept darting away from the casket, as if he couldn't bear to look at Grandmother's peaceful face. The war had aged him terribly. Deep lines etched his forehead, and his once robust frame had withered to something almost skeletal. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice cracking like autumn leaves, "we gather today to lay to rest Abigail Whitmore, matriarch of this great family, pillar of our community. But something was wrong. Pastor Hawthorne's hands shook more violently now, and sweat beaded on his brow despite the shade. His voice grew louder, more agitated, as if fighting against some internal demon. She was... He stopped mid-sentence, staring at the casket with wild eyes. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Uncle Theodore cleared his throat, and Mother shifted beside me, her gloved hand tightening on my arm. Then Pastor Hawthorne's face contorted with anguish, and he threw his Bible to the ground with such force that several mourners gasped. "No!" he screamed, his voice echoing across the plantation grounds. "I cannot do this. I cannot stand here and speak lies over her grave when the truth burns in my chest like hellfire." Father stepped forward, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Pastor, please. They carry the wrong blood," Hawthorne shrieked, pointing a gnarled finger at our family circle. "The wrong blood. She knew it. I knew it, and God forgive us both for keeping silent all these years." The words hit like a physical blow. Aunt Margaret swooned into her husband's arms, and I heard Mother's sharp intake of breath. But it was the look on Father's face that truly frightened me. Not confusion, but recognition. He knew something. "The children she hid," Pastor Hawthorne continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "The ones she sent away. They should be standing here, not you, not any of you." Uncle Theodore and 2 of the field hands moved to restrain the pastor, but he broke free with surprising strength, stumbling toward the woods that bordered our property. "The blood remembers," he called back to us, his voice growing fainter as he disappeared into the tree line. "The blood always remembers." The funeral dissolved into chaos. Relatives whispered frantically among themselves, and I caught fragments of hushed conversations. "Always said he was touched. The war broke his mind. Never should have trusted him with family secrets." But I wasn't listening to their dismissals. I was watching Father's face, seeing the way his jaw clenched and his eyes avoided mine. I was remembering all the times Grandmother had stopped mid-sentence when I entered a room, all the locked doors and whispered conversations that ceased when I approached. As the family dispersed in uncomfortable silence, promising to reconvene for a proper service once suitable arrangements could be made, I lingered by Grandmother's casket. The afternoon sun slanted through the oak leaves, casting dancing shadows across her serene face. She looked exactly as she had in life, dignified, composed, keeping her secrets even in death. "What did you hide, Grandmother?" I whispered to her still form. "What blood did Pastor Hawthorne mean?" The wind rustled through the Spanish moss, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice. "Some truths are buried for good reason, child. Some stones are better left unturned." But I had never been one to heed warnings, especially when they came wrapped in mystery. As the last of the mourners made their way back to the main house, I made a silent promise to the woman who had raised me with iron discipline and hidden tenderness. I would find the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. The plantation house loomed before me as I walked back across the grounds, its white columns gleaming in the fading light. Somewhere within those walls lay the answers to Pastor Hawthorne's cryptic words. Somewhere in the rooms where I had played as a child, where I had learned to be a proper Southern lady, lay the secret that had driven a man of God to madness. I could feel it calling to me, this hidden truth, like a whisper in the wind. The blood remembers, Pastor Hawthorne had said. Tonight, I would help it remember. The house felt different that evening, as if Pastor Hawthorne's words had shifted something fundamental in its very foundations. I sat through dinner in the formal dining room, picking at Cook's famous cornbread, while the adults spoke in hushed tones about arrangements and damage control. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the mahogany table, and I found myself studying the faces of my family members as if seeing them for the first time. Father barely touched his food, his military posture rigid even in grief. Mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, but I noticed how her gaze kept drifting to the portrait of grandmother that hung above the fireplace. Uncle Theodore dominated the conversation, as he always did, speaking of the need to maintain dignity and protect the family name. "The pastor has clearly suffered a mental collapse," he declared, cutting his ham with precise movements. "The war affected many men in unfortunate ways. We must ensure that his outburst doesn't reflect poorly on Mother's memory." "But what if—" Aunt Margaret began, then stopped when Uncle Theodore's sharp gaze fell upon her. "What if what, Margaret?" "Nothing," she whispered, returning to her plate. "Nothing at all." I excused myself early, claiming exhaustion, but sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. I waited in my room until the house settled into its familiar nighttime rhythms, the creak of floorboards as the servants finished their duties, the distant sound of Father's study door closing, the whisper of Mother's silk dress as she retired to her chambers. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, I lit a small oil lamp and crept from my room. The Whitmore plantation house was a maze of memories built by my great-grandfather in the 1820s and expanded over the decades. I knew every creaking board, every hidden alcove, every secret passage that the architect had built for reasons lost to time. But tonight, I was drawn to a place I had rarely ventured, the attic. The narrow stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, the lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew thick and dusty, filled with the scent of old wood and forgotten things. Cobwebs brushed against my face as I pushed open the heavy door. The attic stretched the length of the house, filled with the detritus of 3 generations. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the lamplight, and towers of trunks and boxes created a labyrinth of family history. I had played here as a child, but grandmother had always warned me away from certain areas, claiming they contained nothing of interest to young ladies. Now, those forbidden corners called to me. I made my way carefully through the maze, my lamp illuminating glimpses of the past. My grandfather's military uniform from the Mexican War, Mother's wedding dress wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, boxes of books and papers that chronicled the rise of the Whitmore fortune. But it was in the farthest corner, behind a stack of portrait frames, that I found what I was looking for. A trunk, smaller than the others, made of dark wood and bound with iron. Unlike the other storage containers, this one bore no family initials, no identifying marks. It sat alone, as if deliberately separated from the rest of our history. The lock was old, but well maintained, and to my surprise, it opened easily when I tried the latch. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a collection that made my breath catch in my throat. Letters, dozens of them tied with faded ribbon. Photographs, daguerreotypes in silver frames, their subjects' faces staring out with haunting intensity, and beneath it all, official documents bearing seals and signatures that made my hands tremble as I lifted them into the lamplight. The first letter was dated 1854, written in grandmother's careful script. "My dearest Samuel, I write this knowing that our correspondence grows more dangerous with each passing day. The children are well and growing strong, though I fear for their future in this world that would deny their very existence. Thomas has your eyes, and Sarah your gentle spirit. They ask for their father daily, and it breaks my heart that I cannot give them the truth they deserve. The arrangements you suggested may be our only option. My husband grows suspicious, and the neighbors have begun to whisper. If we are to protect them, we must act soon. With all my love and eternal devotion, Abigail." My hands shook as I set the letter aside and reached for the photographs. The first showed a young woman I barely recognized as my grandmother. Her face softer, her eyes bright with happiness I had never seen in life. Beside her stood a tall, handsome man with dark skin and kind eyes, his arm around her waist in a pose that spoke of deep intimacy. But it was the second photograph that stole my breath entirely. Two children, perhaps 6 years old, sat on a wooden porch I didn't recognize. The boy had grandmother's strong jaw and determined expression, while the girl possessed a delicate beauty that reminded me of the portraits of our female ancestors. But their skin told a different story, the warm brown that marked them as children of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. At the bottom of the photograph, in grandmother's handwriting, "Thomas and Sarah, my hidden treasures, 1860. I sank back on my heels, the implications crashing over me like a tide. Grandmother had had other children, children she had hidden away, children whose very existence would have destroyed the Whitmore name and fortune. In the rigid social structure of the antebellum South, such a scandal would have meant ruin for the entire family. But where were they now? The letters spoke of arrangements and protection, but what had become of Thomas and Sarah? I reached for more documents, finding birth certificates that had never been filed, property deeds for land I didn't recognize, and finally, a letter that made my blood run cold. "Jeremiah, the deed is done. The children have been placed with the Freedmen's Bureau in Savannah, their identities changed to protect them from those who would do them harm. Samuel has agreed to the separation, though it nearly killed us both. They will be told their parents died in the war, a lie that serves the greater truth of keeping them safe. You must promise me as a man of God that this secret dies with us. The Whitmore name must survive, but more importantly, Thomas and Sarah must live free from the burden of their birth. They deserve a chance at happiness, even if it means they can never know their true heritage. I have arranged for funds to be set aside for their education and care, channeled through the church. You will oversee this, as we discussed. When I am gone, burn these letters and let the past remain buried. May God forgive us all. Abigail Whitmore. September 15th, 1865. The letter was addressed to Pastor Hawthorne. I sat in the dusty attic, surrounded by the evidence of my family's greatest secret, and understood at last why the pastor had broken down at the funeral. For 7 years, he had carried this burden, watching the Whitmore family prosper while the true heirs lived in obscurity. The guilt had finally consumed him. But grandmother's instructions had been clear. The secret was meant to die with her. The funds she had arranged, the careful separation, it had all been designed to protect Thomas and Sarah from a world that would reject them while ensuring they could build lives of their own. Yet here I sat, holding their photographs, reading their story, faced with a choice that would define not just my future, but theirs as well. In the distance, I heard the sound of footsteps on the main stairs. Someone else was awake, moving through the house with purpose. I quickly gathered the letters and photographs, my heart pounding as I realized the magnitude of what I had discovered. The blood remembers, Pastor Hawthorne had said. Now I understood what he meant. The blood of Thomas and Sarah Whitmore, my half-uncle and half-aunt, called out for recognition, for justice, for the inheritance that was rightfully theirs. But was I brave enough to answer that call? As I crept back down the attic stairs, the evidence of my family's secret hidden beneath my nightgown, I knew that my life had just taken a turn from which there would be no return. The question was no longer what grandmother had hidden. The question was what I was going to do about it. I barely slept that night, the letters and photographs hidden beneath my mattress like burning coals. Every creak of the house made me start. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. When dawn finally broke through my bedroom windows, I felt as though I had aged years in a single night. The breakfast table was unusually quiet. Father sat behind his newspaper, but I noticed how his eyes never moved across the page. Mother picked at her eggs while Uncle Theodore dominated the conversation with plans for grandmother's proper funeral service. "I've spoken with Pastor Morrison from Savannah," he announced, buttering his toast with mechanical precision. "He'll conduct the service this afternoon. We cannot allow yesterday's incident to overshadow Mother's legacy." "What about Pastor Hawthorne?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Shouldn't someone check on him?" He seemed quite distressed. Uncle Theodore's knife paused mid-spread. "Pastor Hawthorne is no longer our concern. I've arranged for him to receive care at the state hospital in Milledgeville. His mind has clearly been affected by the war." "You had him committed?" The words escaped before I could stop them. Father finally looked up from his newspaper, his grey eyes studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "It's for his own good, Catherine." The man was clearly suffering from some form of nervous exhaustion, but I saw the truth in their carefully neutral expressions. Pastor Hawthorne hadn't been committed for his own good. He had been silenced before he could say more about the wrong blood and the children grandmother had hidden. After breakfast, I excused myself to walk in the garden, claiming I needed fresh air to clear my head. In truth, I needed time to think, to plan, to decide what to do with the terrible knowledge burning in my chest. The garden had been grandmother's pride, a carefully cultivated paradise of roses, magnolias, and jasmine that perfumed the air with southern sweetness. I found myself drawn to her favorite bench, positioned beneath an ancient live oak, where she used to sit in the evenings, watching the sun set over the cotton fields. It was there that I encountered Moses. Moses had worked for our family since before I was born, one of the few former slaves who had chosen to stay on as paid workers after the war. He was a man of few words but deep wisdom, and grandmother had trusted him with responsibilities that other white families would never have granted to a black man. He was tending to the rose bushes when I approached, his weathered hands gentle among the thorns. When he saw me, he straightened slowly, his dark eyes holding a knowledge that made my breath catch. "Miss Catherine," he said quietly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," I replied, studying his face. "Moses, how long did you know my grandmother?" "Since she was younger than you are now," he said, returning to his pruning. "Watched her grow up, get married, raise her children. Watched her make choices that would have broken a lesser woman." The way he said it with such careful emphasis made me certain he knew about the letters, about Thomas and Sarah. "What kind of choices?" Moses was quiet for a long moment, his shears clicking softly among the roses. "The kind that keep some folks safe, while others carry the burden. The kind that make you wonder late at night if you did right or just did what was necessary." "Moses," I said, stepping closer, "if someone discovered a secret, a family secret that could change everything, what would you advise them to do?" He set down his shears and looked at me directly, his eyes holding decades of hard-won wisdom. "Depends on the secret, Miss Catherine. Some secrets are meant to protect folks. Others are meant to protect lies. The trick is knowing which is which." "And how does one know?" "You ask yourself who benefits from the keeping of it and who suffers. You ask yourself if the truth would heal old wounds or open new ones, and then you pray for the wisdom to choose right." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was coming up the main drive, moving fast enough to raise dust clouds in the morning air. Moses and I watched as the figure resolved into a young man I didn't recognize, well-dressed but travel-worn, with the bearing of someone accustomed to hard work. He dismounted at the front steps and was met by Father, who had emerged from the house at the sound of the horse. I was too far away to hear their conversation, but I could see the tension in Father's posture, the way his hand moved instinctively to where his sidearm would have hung during the war. The stranger handed Father an envelope, spoke a few brief words, then remounted and rode away as quickly as he had come. Father stood on the steps for a long moment, staring at the envelope in his hands before disappearing back into the house. "Trouble coming," Moses murmured, gathering his tools. "Can feel it in the air like a storm." I spent the rest of the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, waiting for whatever news the mysterious rider had brought. The answer came at lunch, when Father called the family together in the parlor. His face was grave as he stood before the fireplace, the envelope in his hands. "I've received word from Savannah," he began, his voice carefully controlled. "It concerns Pastor Hawthorne." Uncle Theodore leaned forward in his chair. "What about him?" "He's dead," Father said simply. "Took his own life sometime during the night. Left behind a letter confessing to various improprieties and asking forgiveness for the burden he had carried." The room fell silent. Mother's hand flew to her throat, and Aunt Margaret made a small sound of distress. But it was Uncle Theodore's reaction that caught my attention, a brief flash of what looked almost like relief before his features settled into appropriate sorrow. "How tragic," he said. The poor man's mind was clearly more damaged than we realized. "Indeed," Father agreed. "The letter has been turned over to the church authorities. They assure me that Pastor Hawthorne's final words will be treated with appropriate discretion." I felt the blood drain from my face. Pastor Hawthorne was dead, and with him died the only other person who knew the truth about Thomas and Sarah. Whether by coincidence or design, the secret was now mine alone to bear. That afternoon, we buried Grandmother with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a Southern matriarch. Pastor Morrison spoke eloquently of her charitable works, her devotion to family, her strength during the difficult years of war and reconstruction. The assembled mourners nodded approvingly, satisfied that the Whitmore reputation remained untarnished. But as I stood beside her grave, watching the red Georgia clay fall onto her casket, I thought about the children she had loved enough to sacrifice, the man she had cared for enough to risk everything, and the pastor who had died carrying her secrets. "The blood remembers," Pastor Hawthorne had said. Standing there in the shadow of the ancient oaks, surrounded by the lies and half-truths that had built my family's fortune, I made my decision. I would find Thomas and Sarah. I would learn what had become of Grandmother's hidden children, and then I would decide whether the truth was worth the price it would demand. As the mourners dispersed and the gravediggers began their final work, I noticed Moses standing at the edge of the cemetery, his hat in his hands. When our eyes met across the distance, he nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both understanding and approval. The search for my lost family was about to begin. 3 days after the funeral, I began my investigation in earnest. The house had returned to its normal rhythms, Father immersed in plantation business, Mother organizing social calls, Uncle Theodore managing what he called family interests from his temporary residence in Grandmother's former study. Their assumption that life would simply continue as before gave me the freedom I needed to pursue the truth. My first challenge was accessing the family's financial records without arousing suspicion. Grandmother had been meticulous in her record-keeping, and if she had indeed arranged for funds to support Thomas and Sarah, there would be evidence somewhere in the ledgers and correspondence that filled the locked cabinets in Father's office. The opportunity came when Father traveled to Savannah on business, taking Uncle Theodore with him to meet with cotton buyers. I waited until Mother departed for her weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting, then made my way to the study with a set of keys I had borrowed from Father's dresser. The office smelled of tobacco and leather, masculine scents that had always intimidated me as a child. Now, surrounded by the tools of power that had built the Whitmore fortune, I felt only determination. I began with the most recent ledgers, working backward through the years. At first, I found nothing unusual: the expected entries for household expenses, field workers' wages, equipment purchases, and social obligations. But as I delved deeper into the records from the 1860s, patterns began to emerge. Starting in 1865, there were regular payments listed as charitable contributions to something called the Savannah Educational Fund. The amounts were substantial, enough to support a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, and they had continued without interruption until grandmother's death. More intriguingly, these payments were always made through an intermediary, the First Baptist Church of Savannah. I copied the relevant information into a small notebook, my hands trembling with excitement. This had to be how grandmother had supported Thomas and Sarah while maintaining the fiction of their non-existence. But I needed more than financial records. I needed to know what had become of the children themselves. The next morning, I announced my intention to visit Savannah to pay respects at the graves of distant relatives, a plausible excuse that would allow me several days of investigation without arousing suspicion. Mother fretted about the propriety of a young lady traveling alone, but I reminded her that I would be staying with our family friends, the Merriweathers, and that their driver would meet me at the station. The train journey to Savannah gave me time to plan my approach. I had the name of the church, the dates of the payments, and the photographs from grandmother's trunk. If Thomas and Sarah had indeed been placed with the Freedmen's Bureau, there might be records, people who remembered them, traces of their lives that I could follow. Savannah in 1872 was a city still rebuilding from the war, its elegant squares and antebellum mansions standing alongside newer construction and the bustling commerce of a port city. The Freedmen's Bureau had officially closed the year before, but its work had been taken over by various charitable organizations and churches. I began my search at the First Baptist Church, an imposing brick structure that dominated one of the city's historic squares. The pastor, Reverend William Hayes, was a kindly man in his 60s who received me in his study with the courtesy due to a member of a prominent family. "Miss Whitmore," he said, settling behind his desk with a cup of tea, "how may I be of service? I was sorry to hear of your grandmother's passing. She was a remarkable woman." "Thank you, Reverend Hayes. I'm here because I'm researching our family's charitable activities. I understand that my grandmother made regular contributions to something called the Savannah Educational Fund through your church." A shadow crossed his features, so brief I might have imagined it. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore was quite generous in her support of education for the freedmen. A noble cause, though not always popular among families of your background. "I'm hoping to continue her work," I said carefully. "But I need to understand exactly how the funds were used. Were there specific individuals who benefited from her generosity?" Reverend Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with uncomfortable intensity. "Miss Whitmore, may I ask why you're really here? Your grandmother was very specific about the discretion required in these matters." My heart raced. He knew something. "Reverend, I believe my grandmother may have had personal reasons for her charitable work, reasons that went beyond simple Christian duty." "I see." He rose from his chair and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office. "Your grandmother made me promise that certain information would only be shared with family members who came asking the right questions. I believe you may be asking those questions." He returned with a thin folder, placing it on the desk between us. "Thomas and Sarah Freeman," he said quietly, aged 18 now, both of them. Bright, hard-working young people who have made the most of the opportunities your grandmother provided. Freeman. They had taken new names, new identities, just as grandmother's letter had indicated. Are they still in Savannah? Thomas is studying law at Atlanta University. Sarah married last year, a fine young man named David Johnson who works as a teacher. They live here in the city, in the Yamacraw district. My hands shook as I opened the folder. Inside were school records, letters of recommendation, and a recent photograph that made my breath catch. The children from grandmother's hidden pictures had grown into handsome, accomplished adults. Thomas had developed the strong features of the Whitmore men, while Sarah possessed a delicate beauty that reminded me painfully of our shared grandmother. They don't know, I said, more statement than question. They believe their parents died in the war as your grandmother intended. They've built good lives, Miss Whitmore. They're respected members of the community, contributing citizens who have overcome tremendous obstacles. The question you must ask yourself is whether the truth would help them or destroy everything they've worked to achieve. I stared at the photographs, seeing my own eyes reflected in Thomas's face, recognizing the stubborn set of Sarah's jaw that I had inherited from the same source. These were my family, blood of my blood, hidden away but not forgotten. I need to see them, I said. Reverend Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. Miss Whitmore, I must caution you to consider the consequences. In the eyes of the law and society, these young people are Negroes. Any acknowledgement of their true parentage would not elevate them. It would destroy you and your family. Your grandmother understood this. It's why she made the choices she did. But they have rights, I protested. They're Whitmores. They deserve to live their lives in peace, he interrupted gently. They deserve to raise their children without the burden of a heritage that would make them outcasts in both worlds. Your grandmother's love for them was expressed through sacrifice, not recognition. I left the church with my mind in turmoil, the folder of information clutched in my hands like a lifeline. Reverend Hayes had given me their address, along with a warning that I might be making the greatest mistake of my life. That evening, as I sat in the Merriweather's guest room, I studied the photographs and documents until my eyes burned. Thomas and Sarah Freeman, my half-uncle and half-aunt, though they were only a few years older than myself, had built lives of dignity and purpose despite the circumstances of their birth. But they had built those lives on a foundation of lies. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to shatter that foundation in the name of truth or walk away and let the past remain buried. The blood remembers, Pastor Hawthorne had said. But sometimes I was beginning to understand. Memory was a burden too heavy for the living to bear. I spent a sleepless night wrestling with my conscience, the weight of decision pressing down on me like the humid savannah air. By dawn, I had made my choice. I would meet Thomas and Sarah Freeman, but I would not reveal the truth of their parentage unless they gave me reason to believe it would bring them peace rather than destruction. The Yamacraw district was a world away from the elegant squares of historic Savannah. Here, in the narrow streets lined with modest wooden houses, the freed slaves and their children had built a community of their own. Children played in dusty yards, while women hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. Men walked to work with the purposeful stride of people who had earned their place in the world through determination and sweat. I had dressed simply, hoping to avoid the attention that my usual finery would attract, but I still felt conspicuous as I made my way down the street where Sarah Freeman Johnson lived. The address Reverend Hayes had given me led to a small but well-maintained house with a garden full of vegetables and flowers. I stood at the gate for several minutes, gathering my courage, before finally approaching the front door. My knock was answered by a young woman whose face made my heart stop. Sarah Freeman Johnson was beautiful in a way that transcended the arbitrary boundaries of race and class. Her skin was the warm brown of café au lait, her features delicate but strong, and her eyes, grandmother's eyes, my eyes, held an intelligence and warmth that drew me in immediately. "Yes," she said, studying my face with curious politeness. "May I help you?" "Miss Johnson, Mrs. Johnson, I mean. My name is Catherine Whitmore. I wonder if I might speak with you for a few minutes." Her expression changed instantly, wariness replacing curiosity. The name Whitmore clearly meant something to her, though I couldn't tell if the association was positive or negative. "What about?" she asked carefully. "About your education," I said, using the excuse I had prepared. "I'm researching charitable work in the city, and I understand you were a beneficiary of the Savannah Educational Fund." After a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside to let me enter. The house was small but immaculately kept, furnished with simple but quality pieces that spoke of careful management and pride in one's home. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, wedding pictures, family portraits, images of a life built with love and determination. "Please sit," Sarah said, gesturing to a comfortable chair by the window. "May I offer you some tea?" As she prepared the tea, I studied her movements, seeing echoes of grandmother in the graceful way she carried herself, the precise way she arranged the cups and saucers. When she sat across from me, I found myself searching her face for signs of recognition, some instinctive knowledge of our shared blood. "You said you're researching the educational fund," she prompted. "May I ask why?" "My grandmother recently passed away," I said, choosing my words carefully. "She was involved in charitable work, and I'm hoping to continue her legacy. I wanted to understand how the fund operated, who it helped, what became of the people it supported." Sarah's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. The educational fund changed my life and my brother's. Without it, we never would have had the opportunities we've had." "Your brother?" "Thomas Freeman. He's studying law in Atlanta. We were both orphaned during the war, and the fund provided for our education and care." She paused, studying my face. "You said your grandmother was involved in charitable work. What was her name?" "Abigail Whitmore." The teacup trembled in Sarah's hands, and for a moment I thought she might drop it. When she looked at me again, her eyes held a mixture of emotions I couldn't decipher. "Mrs. Abigail Whitmore," she repeated slowly. She was your grandmother?" "Yes." "Did you know her?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. "I never met her," she said finally. "But I know she was the one who arranged for our care. The pastor who oversaw the fund told us that a kind lady had taken an interest in our welfare, but he never told us her name." "What did he tell you about your parents?" "That they died in the war, that they were good people who would have wanted us to have every opportunity to better ourselves." She looked at me directly. "Why are you really here, Miss Whitmore?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility and danger. I could tell her the truth, that she was my grandmother's daughter, that Whitmore blood flowed in her veins, that she had been denied her birthright to protect both her and the family name. Or I could maintain the fiction that had allowed her to build this life of dignity and purpose. "Because," I said slowly, "I think my grandmother cared about you and your brother more than simple charity would explain. I think there was a personal connection that she never spoke about." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I've always wondered," she whispered. "There were things, little things, that made me think, but I told myself I was being foolish, imagining connections that weren't there." "What kind of things?" "The amount of support we received was far more than other orphans got. The quality of our education, the care taken to ensure we had everything we needed, and—" She hesitated, then rose and went to a small desk in the corner of the room. From a drawer, she withdrew a small object wrapped in silk. It was a locket, silver and delicate, with an intricate pattern of roses engraved on its surface. I recognized it immediately. I had seen grandmother wear it in old portraits, though never in my lifetime. "This was left with me when I was placed with my first foster family," Sarah said, returning to her seat. "The pastor said it belonged to my mother, but I've always wondered, the craftsmanship is so fine, the silver so pure. It seemed too valuable for the kind of people I was told my parents were." I reached into my reticule and withdrew the photograph I had taken from grandmother's trunk, the one showing her with Samuel and the 2 children. With trembling hands, I passed it to Sarah. She stared at the image for a long moment, her face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally a kind of painful understanding. "This is me," she whispered, pointing to the little girl in the photograph, "and Thomas. But who are these people with us?" I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would change everything. "The woman is my grandmother, Abigail Whitmore. The man is Samuel, who worked on our plantation. And you, Sarah, are not just a beneficiary of my grandmother's charity, you're her daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph, as if trying to reconcile the evidence with everything she had believed about herself. "That's impossible," she said finally. You're my half-aunt," I said gently. "And Thomas is my half-uncle. You're Whitmore's, Sarah. You always have been." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window, her hands pressed to her temples. "No," she said. "No, this can't be true. If it were true, that would mean your mother gave you up to protect you. That would mean she loved you enough to sacrifice her own happiness for your safety. That would mean you've been living a lie, but a lie told out of love." Sarah turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you have any idea what you're telling me? Do you understand what this means?" "I think I'm beginning to. It means I'm not who I thought I was. It means my children will carry the blood of slave owners in their veins. It means everything I've built, everything I've believed about myself, is based on a deception. Or," I said quietly, "it means you're exactly who you've always been, a strong, intelligent, beautiful woman who has overcome incredible obstacles to build a life of meaning and purpose. The only difference is that now you know where your strength comes from." She sank back into her chair, the photograph clutched in her hands. "What do you want from me, Catherine? Why did you come here? Why did you tell me this?" It was the question I had been dreading because I wasn't entirely sure of the answer myself. "Because," I said slowly, "I believe you and Thomas have a right to know the truth, and because I believe you have a right to claim what's yours." "What's ours?" "The Whitmore inheritance, the plantation, the family name, all of it." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You think I could walk into white society and claim to be a Whitmore? You think the world would accept me as your equal? You think my children could grow up as anything other than outcasts, belonging to neither world?" "I think," I said, "that the world is changing. I think there might be a way to acknowledge the truth without destroying the lives you've built." "And what about your life, Catherine? What about your family's reputation? What about the scandal this would cause?" I had asked myself the same questions throughout the long night, and I had finally found my answer. Some things are more important than reputation. Some truths are worth the price they demand. Sarah was quiet for a long time, studying the photograph, touching the faces of the parents she had never known she had. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to think about this. I need to talk to Thomas, to my husband. This isn't just my decision to make." "Of course," I said, rising from my chair. "I'm staying with the Merriweathers for another 2 days. If you want to talk more, or if you want to meet with Thomas, you can reach me there." As I prepared to leave, Sarah caught my hand. Catherine," she said, "why are you doing this, really? What do you gain from turning your world upside down?" I looked into her eyes, grandmother's eyes, my eyes, and found the words I hadn't known I was looking for. "I gain a family," I said simply. "I gain the truth. And maybe, if we're very careful and very brave, I gain the chance to right a wrong that has lasted too long." As I walked back through the streets of Yamacraw, I felt the weight of what I had set in motion. There would be no going back now, no returning to the comfortable lies that had shaped my life. I had opened a door that could never be closed, started a conversation that would echo through generations. The blood remembers, Pastor Hawthorne had said. Now, finally, it would have the chance to speak.